Why was she carrying a tray instead of a rifle? That was the first thought that came to the general's mind, though he never said it aloud. She moved quietly, head lowered, step steady, almost invisible in the grand hall filled with polished boots and metals that glittered in the noon light. The clatter of forks, the murmur of voices, the faint hum of an air conditioner, it all blended into a steady drone. No one noticed her, except when they needed their glass refilled or their plate cleared. Her name was Elena Torres, private first class, 25 years old, the kind of soldier who blended into the backdrop, forgotten the moment eyes slid past her. At least, that's what her superiors had decided she was good for, serving food, cleaning trays, pouring coffee for men who never cared to look her in the eye. And maybe she would have stayed invisible. Maybe she would have swallowed the quiet shame that came with it, except for one small detail. A glint of silver, a metal pinned discreetly, almost hidden by the fold of her jacket. It caught the light as she leaned forward, pouring coffee into the cup of a general who had been in the middle of a joke. The reflection flashed across his eyes. His laughter stopped mid-sentence. The room did not yet know it, but silence was coming. Elena felt it before anyone else. The general's gaze lingered on her chest, sharp, searching. She straightened instinctively, her fingers tightening on the handle of the steel pot. For a moment, her pulse hammered in her ears. He asked it plainly. His voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Private Tours, where did you get that medal?" The hall froze. Chairs stopped shifting. Forks hung midair. The air thickened. Every head turned toward her as though she had been invisible seconds ago and was now, suddenly, the only person in the room. Elena did not answer right away. Her breath stalled in her chest. Her eyes flicked from the general's weathered face to the rows of officers staring at her now with suspicion, confusion, something close to disbelief. She felt her cheeks flush, but her spine remained rigid. The Silver Star. They had recognized it. They all had. One of the nation's highest honors for valor in combat. And yet here she was, in kitchen duty whites, serving mashed potatoes to men who had assumed she was nobody. Her heart pounded as silence swallowed the hall. She could have spoken then, could have told them everything. But her story was not one that spilled easily. Because behind that metal lay blood, fire, and nights she still couldn't shake from her dreams. And because the truth was heavy, heavier than the tray she carried, heavier than the silence pressing in around her now. But the general's eyes were unrelenting. The others waited. And Elena knew, sooner or later she would have to speak. The day had begun like any other. She rose before dawn, lacing her boots in the barracks while most were still asleep. Her movements were automatic now, tightening straps, smoothing the creases of her uniform, tucking stray strands of hair into her cap. The mess hall duty roster was posted outside, and her name sat at the bottom of it in neat black ink. Tours, Elena, kitchen support. No surprise. It had been her assignment for weeks. She never argued. Arguments only branded you as difficult, and difficult soldiers were easily discarded. She had learned long ago that silence kept you safe. Still, as she walked across the base that morning, she couldn't help but notice the parade of uniforms around her. Men and women in pressed fatigues, rifles slung over their shoulders, voices carrying the tone of purpose. She carried no rifle. Her purpose was quieter, smaller, tucked away in kitchens and supply lines. Or so they thought. Elena's chest tightened as she passed a group of recruits laughing among themselves. They didn't notice her. They never did. And maybe that was fine. Maybe that was what she wanted. But the metal pinned beneath her jacket said otherwise. She could feel its weight as she walked, the way it tugged lightly at the fabric, a reminder that once she had been seen. Not for kitchen duty, not for silence, for something else entirely. She shoved the thought aside. Not today. Inside the mess hall, the kitchen was already alive with heat and noise. Pots boiled, ovens roared, trays clattered onto counters. She tied on her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and joined the line of servers preparing for the midday luncheon. High-ranking guests, generals, commanders. The kind of men whose decisions carved the fates of people like her. The clatter of trays, the hum of conversation. Elena slipped into her role without hesitation, her body moving as if choreographed. Serve, clear, pour, smile if needed, stay silent if not, invisible, efficient, a ghost in plain sight. Except for that silver glint. When the general's question cut the air, something old stirred in her chest. A memory, a night she had buried deep. A radio crackling, the hiss of sand as bullets tore through it, the smell of smoke and iron. She blinked hard, anchoring herself to the present. Not now, not here. But the hall waited. Elena Tours, she said finally, her voice even quiet. Private first class. It wasn't an answer, not the one they wanted, but it was all she could manage in that moment. The general tilted his head, unsatisfied. His eyes narrowed, drilling into the metal pin to her chest. And slowly the others began to see it too. The realization rippled through the room, soft murmurs rising like distant thunder. Her commanding officer sat stiff at the table, his face draining of color. He had been the one to assign her here. He had thought it a minor task, something safe, something suited for a soldier who, in his words, didn't stand out. Now he stared at the silver star as though it had betrayed him. Elena's throat tightened. She could feel their judgment shifting, recalculating, but she also felt the old weight pressing down, the weight of memory. Because that metal did not come easily, and to speak of it was to speak of nights that never left her. She lowered her gaze, the silence stretched on. In her mind, she was no longer standing in a polished mess hall beneath fluorescent lights. She was back in the desert, back on the night when everything changed. She could hear the screams, the static of the radio, the crack of rifles in the dark. And though she stood tall now, her hands steady on the tray, inside she was shaking. Because to tell them the truth was to open a wound that had never fully healed. And yet maybe it was time. Across the room, the general set down his fork. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer, less of a demand, more of an invitation. Private Tours, tell us. Elena drew a slow breath. Her story was waiting at the edge of her tongue. The story no one here wanted to believe, yet none could deny. But not yet, not all at once. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, steadying herself. And when she opened them again, she let her voice carry, soft, measured but unshakable. It was a night I'll never forget, she began. The hall leaned closer. Every fork, every cup, every sound in the room stilled. And Elena Tours, once invisible, prepared to speak a truth that would change everything. What does courage sound like? Is it the crack of rifles echoing across a valley, the heavy breath of a soldier crawling through dust, or is it quieter, so quiet it trembles in the chest, half hidden behind fear? Elena never thought of herself as brave. She thought of herself as ordinary. A girl from San Antonio who had enlisted at 19, hopping for purpose, maybe a little pride. What she found instead was sand, heat, and the sound of men screaming in the dark. The night that would change everything began with silence, too much silence. Her unit had been tasked with securing a remote checkpoint on the edge of hostile territory. It was supposed to be routine, a presence patrol, nothing more. She remembered the convoy bouncing along a cracked road, headlights dimmed, the desert stretching endless and pale beneath the moonlight. The radio crackled with updates, clipped voices carrying codes that only half made sense to her. She kept her weapon close, her eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing but sand and shadow. But soldiers learn early. Silence can be the loudest warning. The ambush came without a shout, without warning. One moment the night was still. The next, hell exploded around them. The first RPG screamed overhead, striking the lead vehicle. Fire ripped open the dark. The convoy jolted to a halt, the smell of burning fuel filling the air. Then came the gunfire, an avalanche of rounds ripping from the ridgeline, sparks and dirt exploding inches from where she crouched. "Elena down," someone shouted. She dropped, pressed into the sand, heart pounding so hard it drowned out the world. Her ears rang. Her mouth tasted of grit. Fear seized her chest, sharp and choking. She wanted to vanish, to dig into the earth and never surface. But then she heard it, a voice, a scream. "Medic, we need a medic." She turned, eyes widening. The squad leader was down, blood soaking through his uniform. Another soldier dragged him toward cover, but rounds chewed the ground around them. They weren't going to make it. Her hands trembled, her instincts warred inside her. Stay down, stay safe. That's what training said, that's what fear demanded. But something else spoke louder. No one else was moving, no one else could. If she didn't go, he would die. Elena's breath caught, and then, before she could think herself out of it, she crawled forward. Bullets hissed past her helmet, snapping the air. The ground vibrated beneath the roar of explosions. She flattened her body, dragging herself inch by inch across the open gap. Sand scraped her skin. Sweat stung her eyes. Every movement felt like it could be her last. But she didn't stop. She reached the squad leader, grabbed him beneath the arms, and with a grunt that tore her throat raw, pulled him back toward the broken husk of an overturned vehicle. Every inch felt impossible, but adrenaline drove her, fear sharpened her. And somewhere beneath it all was something deeper, something she couldn't name then, but later others would call courage. She made it, collapsed behind cover, chest heaving, the officer bleeding in her lap. His eyes flickered open, cloudy with pain. You didn't leave me," he rasped. "No one gets left," she whispered, though her hands were shaking as she pressed bandages against his wound. The firefight raged on. And then another cry pierced the night. "Over here, somebody help." Elena looked up. Another soldier pinned behind a shredded Humvee, leg mangled by shrapnel. The others were pinned too, fire raining so heavy no one dared move. Her stomach knotted. How many times could she do this before her luck ended? But she didn't ask, she didn't weigh the odds, she just moved. Again she crawled into the storm. Again the desert lit with fire around her. She felt the sear of heat as a round tore past her shoulder, close enough to singe fabric. Her chest screamed for air, but she kept moving inch by inch, grit biting into her skin. She reached him, dragged him too. His face was twisted in agony, but his grip on her sleeve was iron, desperate. She hauled him across the dirt, her back screaming with the strain, but she didn't let go, not once. By the time they reached cover, her arms were shaking, her breath ragged. She wanted to collapse, to disappear into the sand. But there were more. She lost track of how many times she went back. 3, 4. Each time the space between heartbeats stretched thin, her life dangling on the edge of a bullet she couldn't see coming. Each time she told herself it was the last, and each time she went again. At some point the radio in her hand came alive with frantic voices. Reinforcements were still miles away. They had to hold. So she held. When ammo ran low, she crawled to the wounded, handing out magazines. When the radio sputtered, she whispered coordinates through static, her voice steady despite the chaos clawing at her nerves. And when one of the younger soldiers began to panic, hands trembling too hard to reload his rifle, she pressed her own steady hands over his, guiding him, whispering, "Breathe. Just breathe." She didn't know where the strength came from. All she knew was that the moment she stopped, someone would die. Hours stretched like years. The firefight pulsed, waves of fire breaking against their thin defenses. The desert burned with smoke, blood, and fire. And still she moved. By the time reinforcements arrived, Elena's uniform was soaked through with sweat and dust. Her hands were blood-stained, not her own, but from the men she'd dragged, the wounds she'd bound, the lives she had refused to let go. The ridgeline fell silent as friendly firepower roared in, scattering the ambushers. The survivors of her unit, shaken, battered, bleeding, looked at her with wide eyes. None of them spoke. None of them had words. Elena sat against the husk of a vehicle, chest heaving, weapon limp in her lap. The dawn was breaking, pale light washing over the desert, revealing the wreckage of the night. Someone knelt beside her. A medic finally arrived. He pressed water into her hands. She drank, though she barely tasted it. "Private," he said softly, staring at her, "you saved them." Her eyes flicked to the wounded men lying in rows, alive because she had refused to stop. She wanted to feel pride, relief, something. But all she felt was the weight of faces she couldn't save, the silence of the ones who hadn't made it. That night never left her. It clung to her skin, her dreams. The smell of smoke, the sound of screams, it lived inside her, even as weeks passed, even as medals were pinned to her chest. They called her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She felt tired, changed. And when she returned stateside, when orders placed her in kitchen duty, she didn't protest. Let them think she was ordinary. Let them forget. It was easier that way. Until now. Until this moment, in a mess hall buzzing with silence, with every eye on her, waiting for her truth. She took a slow breath, grounding herself against the weight of memory. And she began. "I wasn't supposed to come back alive," she said quietly. "None of us were." The room leaned closer, listening. And for the first time, Elena let the story spill from her lips, not to command, not to impress, but to remember, to honor, to finally speak aloud what had been carried in silence. Her voice trembled at first, but it steadied as she spoke. The ambush, the chaos, the dragging of bodies across open ground, the way her hands shook but still moved, the way fear threatened to paralyze her but never quite won. She told them everything, not in the words of a hero, but in the words of someone who had simply refused to give up. And as the generals listened, the truth cut through the silence like fire through smoke. She had not been invisible, she had only been unseen. Until now. Why did the room feel heavier now? Nothing had changed. The tables, the trays, the polished boots lined in neat rows. And yet every officer, every general, sat frozen in their seats as though the air itself had thickened. Elena's voice had finished, but the echo of her story lingered. It was there in the silence. It was there in the way eyes refused to look away from her, as though they were afraid if they blinked, she might disappear again. Her throat was dry. Her hands, though steady at her sides, ached from clenching too hard. She wished she could slip back into invisibility, fade behind the clatter of trays and the ordinary routine. But the silence wouldn't let her. The general who had asked the question leaned back slowly in his chair. His jaw was tight, his gaze sharp, but there was something else now, something softer, almost unsteady. He studied her as though searching for the soldier behind the servant's apron. Across the room, her commanding officer sat rigid. His face had drained of color. Only now did Elena notice the sweat on his temple, the stiffness in his shoulders. He had been the one to assign her here to kitchen duty, never once asking about the medal half hidden on her chest. She wondered what he felt now: shame, guilt, regret, perhaps all three. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, but the words stuck. Elena's heart pounded. For a brief, irrational moment, she wondered if she had said too much, if speaking the truth had been a mistake. But then slowly one of the generals stood. His boots scraped against the floor, loud in the silence. He crossed the room with measured steps, eyes fixed on her. Elena's breath caught. She had faced gunfire, explosions, nights filled with screams. But this, standing exposed in front of men who once dismissed her, was a different kind of fear. The general stopped in front of her. For a heartbeat, he simply looked at her. Then, with deliberate precision, he raised his hand and saluted. The sound of his voice, low but steady, carried through the hall. "For valor, Private Tours." The silence cracked. Another chair scraped back. Another general rose, then another. One by one they crossed the hall, not hurried, not perfunctory. Each came to stand before her. Some shook her hand, some gave a sharp nod. A few, their eyes glistening, spoke words she barely processed. "Thank you. Your courage saved lives. You honored the uniform. And then the unthinkable, her commanding officer rose. His boots dragged across the floor, slower than the others, heavier. He stopped before her, unable at first to meet her eyes. His voice, when it came, was thick. "I owe you an apology," he said, each word sounding as though it cost him something. "I dismissed you. I ignored what I should have seen. That was my failure, not yours." Elena felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to say it didn't matter, that she didn't need his apology, but deep down, a part of her, the part that had swallowed silence for so long, did need to hear it. She gave a small nod, nothing more. The hall was still watching. Some soldiers looked stricken, as though the ground had shifted beneath them. Others looked inspired, as though seeing her lit something inside them. Elena wanted to shrink, to step away, to disappear again. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Pride, not loud, not boastful, quiet, steady. She straightened her posture, shoulders back, chin lifted. She was not invisible now. The days that followed blurred into something she could hardly recognize. Words spread quickly across the base, faster than she could have imagined. By the second morning, soldiers she barely knew were greeting her in the corridors. Some offered salutes, others shy nods of respect. A few whispered, "Thank you," as they passed. It unsettled her at first. She wasn't used to eyes lingering on her, not in admiration. She had built herself into a shadow, surviving on quiet efficiency, unnoticed movements. Now the light found her wherever she went. Even her peers, soldiers who had once laughed past her without seeing her, now stopped to ask about her story. Some were blunt. "How'd you do it?" Others softer. "Were you scared?" A few just stood near her, awkward and silent, as though hopping her presence alone might pass something unspoken to them. And through it all, Elena kept her composure, polite, reserved, always humble, but inside there was a storm. Recognition was a strange weight, heavier in some ways than invisibility. Because now they looked to her as an example, a symbol, and she wondered if she could bear it. That evening she sat alone on the barrack steps. The sun was sinking, painting the horizon in bruised orange and purple. The base was alive with its usual rhythms, trucks growling, boots striking pavement, voices carrying across open yards. But Elena let it all fade, her gaze distant. She thought of the men she had dragged through the sand. She thought of the ones she hadn't been able to save. Their faces returned, sharp in her memory. The metal on her chest gleamed faintly in the dying light, but to her, it felt like an anchor. She whispered their names to herself, barely audible. It was her ritual, the one thing she did to keep them close, to remind herself the metal wasn't hers alone. Footsteps approached. She didn't look up until a shadow fell across her boots. It was her commanding officer, the same man who had dismissed her, who had shamed himself in front of the entire hall. He stood there awkwardly, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. "Private Tours," he said quietly, "may I sit?" She nodded. For a while they sat in silence. The officer's jaw worked, as though the words tangled inside him. Finally he spoke. "When I first saw you," he admitted, "I thought you were ordinary, quiet. Someone who'd do as she was told and not much else. I never thought," he stopped himself. "I never asked. That was my mistake." Elena turned her eyes toward him. His face was lined with something more than age, remorse perhaps. "You saved lives," he said softly, "and I treated you like a servant." She didn't respond. Words weren't necessary. The officer exhaled heavily. "I'll carry that mistake, but I need you to know something, Tours. You've reminded me of what I forgot, that courage isn't loud. It doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it serves quietly until it's called." Her chest tightened. For the first time she saw sincerity in his eyes. She gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." It was all she said, all she needed to say. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Orders shifted. Assignments reshuffled. Elena was no longer relegated to trays and kitchens. Instead, she was asked to sit with new recruits, to mentor them, to share the lessons she had lived but never spoken. At first, she resisted. She didn't see herself as a teacher, but the recruits looked at her differently than the officers did. Their eyes were wide with the hunger of those not yet tested. They wanted guidance. They wanted truth. So she gave it, not in speeches, not in lofty words, but in the same quiet way she had carried herself through everything. She told them that fear was not weakness, that courage was simply moving anyway, that medals didn't erase the weight of memory, that the strongest soldiers weren't always the loudest. And when they asked how she had survived that night, she told them the only truth she believed. I couldn't leave them, that's all. I couldn't leave them. The recruits listened, eyes sharp, hearts open. And slowly, Elena began to see the ripple of her story extend beyond her own chest. It was no longer just her burden. It was a lesson, a light passed forward. Back in the mess hall, life returned to its rhythm. Trays clattered, officers laughed, boots struck the floor. But Elena was no longer invisible. When she walked in, eyes met hers. When she poured coffee, hands steadied to thank her. When the silver glint caught the light, no one ignored it anymore. She didn't crave their admiration, but she accepted their respect. Because sometimes dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes it doesn't demand. Sometimes it simply acts and waits for the world to notice. How does it feel to be seen after years of being invisible? At first, Elena thought it would feel like freedom, like vindication, like the weight of silence finally lifted. But the truth was more complicated. Being seen came with new eyes, new expectations. And with each salute, each nod of respect, she felt another weight pressing down on her chest. It began the morning she was summoned to the commander's office. She walked the corridor with measured steps, her boots clicking against the linoleum floor, heart tight with unease. The summons was formal, but the glances she received along the way told her this wasn't routine. Soldiers who once brushed past her now shifted aside, giving her space. Some nodded, some whispered. She knocked once on the commander's door. "Enter." The office smelled of paper and polished wood. The commander sat behind a wide desk, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. Elena stood at attention, eyes fixed on the far wall. "At ease," he said, though his tone carried weight. "Private tours, you've made an impression." She shifted slightly, hands behind her back. She didn't answer. The commander leaned forward, studying her. "Your story, it spread, not just through this base. Higher, much higher. People are talking tours, they see you as an example." Her chest tightened. She didn't want to be an example. She wanted to be left alone, to carry her memories quietly, without the weight of strangers' expectations. The commander continued. "We're reassigning you. No more kitchen duty. Effective immediately, you'll be assisting with recruit mentorship, guidance, morale, leadership. You've lived what most of them haven't even imagined. They need that. They need you." Elena swallowed hard. She wanted to protest, to say she wasn't qualified, wasn't ready, wasn't who they thought she was. But she also knew what refusal looked like. She'd been in the army long enough to understand that orders weren't invitations. "Yes, sir," she said, voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Good," the commander said. His eyes softened just slightly. "And tours, you earned that medal. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." She nodded once, saluted, and walked out. Her first session with the recruits was nothing like she expected. They sat in rows on benches, uniforms loose, boots scuffed, eyes bright with the restless energy of youth. Some leaned forward eagerly. Others lounged back, skeptical, arms crossed as though daring her to prove herself. Elena stood at the front, hands folded loosely. She wasn't a speaker. She wasn't polished, didn't have the booming voice of a drill sergeant. The silence stretched too long. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting, measuring. Finally, one recruit, a boy barely 19, freckles sharp across his face, spoke first. "Ma'am, is it true that you dragged 4 men out under fire?" The others leaned closer, curiosity sparking. Elena's stomach tightened. The question wasn't cruel, but it cut deep. She didn't like the story framed that way, as numbers, as heroics. She remembered the screams, the blood, the weight of bodies that might have slipped from her grip if she'd faltered for even a second. She drew a slow breath. "Yes, but that's not what matters." The recruits frowned, confused. She let the pause hang before speaking again. "What matters is that I was scared out of my mind. Every second. I thought I'd die out there. I almost froze, but I moved anyway. That's all courage is, moving when you're scared, nothing more." The room was silent. She saw the shift in their faces, the surprise, the way skepticism softened into thought. Another recruit raised a hand hesitantly. "So, you didn't think of yourself as a hero?" Her throat tightened. The words sat heavy in the air. "No," she said finally. "I still don't. I thought of the people bleeding on the ground. I thought of what would happen if I didn't move. That was it. I wasn't trying to be brave. I just couldn't leave them." The recruits exchanged glances. Some nodded slowly, others looked unsettled. And in that moment, Elena realized what her role was, not to dazzle them with heroics, not to feed myths of invincibility, but to give them the truth. Raw, human. Weeks passed. She met with the recruits regularly. Some sessions were structured, others informal, small circles where stories were shared in hushed voices. She listened as much as she spoke, and in her quiet way she became a presence they leaned on. They came to her after drills, sweat still clinging to their brows, asking about fear, about loss, about the thoughts they were too ashamed to admit to anyone else. "Do you ever stop hearing the gunfire in your dreams?" one whispered late one evening. "No," Elena answered softly, "but you learn to carry it." "Were you ever afraid people wouldn't believe you?" another asked. "All the time," she admitted. "But belief isn't the point. The truth exists whether they see it or not." The recruits listened. Some nodded, some swallowed hard, and Elena saw in their eyes the reflection of what she had once been, young, uncertain, searching for a reason to believe they could survive what was coming. And yet, even as she gave them strength, she felt her own trembling beneath the surface. At night, when the barracks grew quiet, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling, her body still but her mind racing. She replayed the ambush over and over, the memories sharpening instead of dulling. She heard their voices, the wounded she had saved, the silence of the ones she hadn't. Recognition had not erased the ghosts. If anything, it had amplified them, because now she couldn't hide from her past. Now her story was told and retold, polished and passed along, until it belonged more to others than to her. And sometimes, when she looked at the recruits' eager faces, she wondered if they saw her as she was, or as the legend others painted of her. That question haunted her more than the gunfire. One evening, after a long day of drills and debriefings, she stepped outside the barracks. The sky was streaked with crimson, the sun sinking low. She leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. Footsteps approached behind her. She turned slightly. It was the freckled recruit, the same one who had asked her about dragging men under fire. He stood awkwardly, shifting his weight. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" he asked. She gave a faint smile. "You don't need permission, not with me." He nodded, then hesitated. "I just wanted to say thank you, not for what you did out there, for what you say in here. You don't make it sound easy. You don't make it sound shiny. You make it real. That helps." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, a warmth, small but steady. She nodded once. "Good, because it isn't easy, and if anyone tells you otherwise, they're lying." The recruit smiled faintly, saluted, and left her standing there, alone with her thoughts. As weeks turned into months, Elena found herself caught in a strange tension. She was both more visible than ever, and yet inside, still unseen. They admired her courage, but they didn't feel her nightmares. They respected her story, but they didn't carry the weight of the names she whispered in the dark. And she wondered often if she could keep carrying both, the respect of the living and the silence of the dead. But each time doubt rose, she remembered the recruits, their wide eyes, their hesitant questions, their need for truth. And she knew why she stayed. Because dignity doesn't always look like pride. Sometimes, it looks like standing in front of a group of young soldiers and admitting you were terrified, and showing them that fear can walk alongside courage. Late one night, sitting on her bunk with the medal in her hand, Elena traced the edge of the silver star with her thumb. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dim light. She whispered, as she always did, "For you." Not for herself, never for herself. For the ones who didn't make it back. For the ones whose silence weighed heavier than her own. And with that, she laid the medal back down, closed her eyes, and prepared to wake tomorrow, to face more questions, more eyes, more weight. Because sometimes survival isn't just crawling through the sand under fire. Sometimes it's learning to live with the aftermath. And that battle was far from over. What happens when a story becomes larger than the person who lived it? That question gnawed at Elena as she walked the base in the weeks after her reassignment. Everywhere she went, eyes followed. Salutes snapped sharper, greetings carried weight. Her presence demanded a gravity she had never asked for. And yet beneath the surface she still carried the same truth. She was tired, she was haunted, she was human. But the base didn't want her humanity. The base wanted her legend. It came to a breaking point one afternoon, under the harsh glare of the midday sun. Elena was with a group of recruits near the motor pool, watching them practice vehicle inspections. Sweat slicked their brows, voices loud with the eager frustration of training. She corrected their posture, reminded them to breathe, kept her own voice steady even though her head pounded from lack of sleep. That's when the alarm sirens cut the air. Sharp, jarring, unmistakable. The recruits froze mid-motion, eyes darting upward. Elena's body tensed instantly. Sirens weren't drills, not at that hour. Through the loudspeakers came the announcement. Security breach at the south perimeter. All personnel stand by. The words slammed into her chest. Security breach on base, here. The recruits looked at her, panic flaring in their young eyes. "Ma'am, what do we do?" one asked, his voice cracking. Elena's own heart hammered. For a moment she was back in the desert, the crack of rifles, the roar of fire. Her palms slickened, her breath shallow. The ghost surged. But the recruits waited. She forced herself to steady. "First you breathe," she said firmly, "then you listen." The loudspeakers barked again. "Unauthorized vehicle approaching inner perimeter. All units respond." The recruits' fear sharpened. Elena scanned their faces. They weren't ready for this, not real danger, not yet. She made a decision. Back inside, to the barracks now. They hesitated. She snapped, "Move." They obeyed, boots pounding against the pavement as they sprinted toward safety. Elena, however, didn't move with them. Her instincts pulled her the other way, toward the danger. She stripped off her outer jacket as she ran, her boots hammering against the ground, the sun blazing off concrete. Other soldiers converged, rifles raised, shouts cutting the air. Elena's breath came fast, but her mind sharpened. The vehicle came into view. A battered truck, its engine roaring, barreling toward the inner checkpoint. The gate guards shouted warnings, their weapons trained, but the vehicle didn't slow. Someone screamed, "Possible VBIED. Vehicle-borne explosive." The words ignited fire in Elena's chest. She froze for half a heartbeat, the memory of burning convoys slamming into her skull. She tasted sand, blood, smoke. But then she saw the soldiers at the gate, young, exposed, standing their ground with rifles aimed. She saw the truck's speed, the impossibility of stopping it in time with bullets alone. Her body moved before her mind finished. She sprinted. Every muscle screamed. Her boots struck the pavement like drumbeats. She felt the world narrow to the pounding of her heart, the roar of the engine, the faces of the men at the gate bracing for death. Clear it, someone shouted. But she didn't clear, she didn't stop. She angled hard, vaulting across a barricade and reached the side of the gatehouse. There, a half-dozen coils of concertina wire sat unused, stacked for reinforcement. She didn't think. She grabbed one, ignoring the sting of barbs slicing her gloves. With raw force, she dragged it across the road, anchoring it against the barrier. The metal screamed as it uncoiled. She heaved it into place just as the truck bore down. The driver swerved too late. The truck slammed into the wire. The metal coils shredded its tires, biting into the chassis, dragging it sideways. The vehicle screeched, spun, and crashed against the barricade with a thunderous shudder. Smoke billowed. Soldiers shouted. Elena dove behind cover, her lungs burning. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then no explosion. The soldiers swarmed, rifles ready, yanking open the doors. Two figures inside, dazed, dragged out, restrained. Not suicide bombers, smugglers, desperate, reckless. The cargo contraband, not explosives. The relief came in a wave, so sharp it nearly knocked her down. But all eyes were on her, again. She stood slowly, her chest heaving, her gloves torn and bloodied from the wire. Soldiers stared, whispers cutting through the heat, some with awe, some with disbelief. And there it was again, that shift, that look, the one that said she wasn't just Elena anymore, she was the legend. The aftermath swelled fast, reports filed, commendations whispered. By evening, the story had already twisted, retold in exaggerated fragments. She stopped a truck with her bare hands. She saved the whole gate. She ran toward it when everyone else froze. The recruits found her in the mess later, eyes wide with awe. "Ma'am," one said breathlessly, "you did it again." Elena wanted to scream. She hadn't done it again. She hadn't felt heroic. She felt terrified. She acted on instinct. She could still feel the sting of wire in her palms, the pounding in her ears, the image of smoke that might have been fire. But none of that fit the story they wanted. So she only nodded, silent. That night, alone in her bunk, Elena sat upright, unable to sleep. Her body ached, her palms stung, but what unsettled her most was the hollow inside her chest. The silver star had been weight enough. Now this, another act to fuel their myth of her. She pressed her hands over her face, whispering into the darkness. "I'm not who they think I am." Her voice broke. But outside her room, soldiers whispered her name. Recruits clung to her story like armor. Officers spoke of her as proof of resilience. And once again she wondered, how long could she carry this weight? The next morning she walked the base in silence. Heads turned. Salutes cracked sharper. The commanding officer stopped her in the corridor, his eyes heavy but filled with something close to respect. "You've set an example, Tors," he said, "one they'll never forget." She nodded faintly, but inside she wanted to ask him. "And what if I fail next time? What if courage doesn't come?" But she didn't speak. Because she knew the truth, legends weren't allowed to falter. Legends weren't allowed to be human. And yet she was. Every night proved it, every nightmare, every whispered name, every time her hands shook when no one was watching. But for now she walked on, silent, carrying a story that grew heavier with every retelling. And though no one could see it, she wondered, was the burden of being seen any lighter than the burden of being invisible? How fast does a story travel? Faster than a convoy through desert roads, faster than the sound of gunfire carried on the wind. By the time a week had passed, Elena's name was no longer just whispered in the mess hall. It was on lips she had never met, in voices far above her rank. It started small, a mention in the base newsletter, a brief commendation at morning formation, then a write-up in the regional military bulletin. But stories never stay small, especially not stories like hers. By the end of the month, her face was in newspapers. quiet heroine of the base, the soldier who served lunch and stopped a truck. Photographs of her in uniform, her silver star glinting, circulated with headlines that spoke of bravery, resilience, sacrifice. She didn't recognize the woman in those pictures. The woman in the photos looked strong, unshakable, noble. Elena saw none of the tremors in her hands, none of the restless nights, none of the moments when she whispered to herself in the dark just to keep steady. The newspapers didn't print the truth, that she was afraid, that she doubted herself, that courage had never felt like courage in the moment. It was all myth, a cleaner version of her. The recruits showed her clippings, their eyes bright with pride. "Look, ma'am, you're famous." Elena forced a small smile, nodding, but inside her stomach turned. Fame was the last thing she wanted. Fame made ghosts heavier. Then came the visit. A black sedan pulled onto the base one crisp morning, its tinted windows reflecting the early sun. Out stepped a senator, flanked by aides and photographers. The air shifted immediately, the kind of shift that told every soldier to stand straighter, march sharper, breathe quieter. Elena had no warning before her commanding officer summoned her. She walked into the courtyard, boots clicking on concrete, and found herself face to face with the senator. Cameras snapped, lenses zoomed. "Private first-class tours," the senator said warmly, extending a hand. "It's an honor." Elena hesitated before shaking it. The senator's grip was firm, rehearsed, his smile polished. "You've inspired not just your fellow soldiers," he continued, voice pitched just loud enough for the press to hear, "but the entire country. People need stories like yours, Private. Stories of quiet courage, of resilience in the face of fear. You remind us what America is made of." Elena felt the words land on her chest like weight. She nodded once, too stiff to respond. Flashbulbs lit her eyes. The senator draped an arm over her shoulder, turning her slightly toward the cameras. "This is the face of true valor," he declared. The cameras clicked louder. And Elena thought, no, this is the face of someone who hasn't slept in 3 nights, someone who still wakes up hearing gunfire. But she said nothing. Because dignity doesn't argue in front of cameras. That evening the story spread again. News channels ran the photos. Clips of the senator praising her played on repeat. Commentators called her the real America, a modern example of selfless service. Her phone, once silent, buzzed with messages. Old friends from San Antonio, strangers who found her name. Letters began arriving at the base, bundles of them, addressed simply, to the hero, Private Elena Tours. She sat at her bunk staring at the stack. She read some. Words of gratitude, words of admiration. Mothers telling her their daughters wanted to be like her. Veterans telling her she gave them pride again. The letters were kind, beautiful even, but they weren't written for her, they were written for the legend. Elena folded them carefully, tucking them into a shoebox under her bed. She whispered into the silence, "I'm not who they think I am." Her voice cracked. The next blow came from higher command. One morning, she was ordered to report to the division headquarters. The building loomed larger, quieter, the kind of place where decisions shaped lives far beyond the walls. Elena walked in, palms damp, her uniform sharper than ever. Inside, generals and colonels sat around a table. They spoke her name with weight, their words rehearsed. "Tours, you've become a symbol," one said, steepling his fingers. "Men and women across the ranks look up to you. Civilians see you as a reminder of sacrifice. We need that. We need you." She shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, sir, I'm just a soldier." The general leaned forward. "Not anymore." Her breath hitched. He laid it out plainly. She would be featured in recruiting campaigns. Her story would be shared at ceremonies. She would represent what they wanted the world to see. Elena sat in silence, her chest heavy. She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell them she was tired, that the weight of being a symbol crushed her more than the silence ever had. But her voice failed her. because orders weren't invitations. She saluted, "Yes, sir." The weeks blurred into something surreal. She stood on stages at ceremonies, metal gleaming beneath the lights. She shook hands with officials. She smiled for photographs. She gave short speeches written for her, words about courage and duty that didn't feel like her own. Each time applause thundered. Each time she felt smaller inside. At night she sat on her bunk, staring at her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back wore a uniform pressed to perfection, medals aligned, posture proud. But in her eyes, Elena saw something no one else did: exhaustion, fear, loneliness. She whispered, as she always did, the names of the ones who didn't come home. That ritual grounded her. It reminded her the medal wasn't just hers, it was theirs. But even that ritual felt threatened now, swallowed by the noise of applause and headlines. One night after a long day of ceremonies, Elena found herself sitting on the steps outside the barracks. The base was quiet, the sky streaked with stars. She held the medal in her hand, fingers brushing its edge. She thought of the recruits, young, wide-eyed, clinging to her words. She thought of the mothers writing letters, the veterans sending thanks. Maybe they didn't see her truth, but maybe they needed the version of her they imagined. Her chest ached. Was that what her life had become? A symbol for others, even if it hollowed her out. Footsteps approached. She turned. It was the freckled recruit again, the one who had always looked at her not with awe, but with curiosity, with honesty. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do you ever wish they didn't know about any of it?" The question cut deep. She stared at him, the weight of silence stretching long. Finally she answered, "Every day." The recruit's brow furrowed. "Then why let them?" She exhaled, voice breaking just slightly. "Because it's bigger than me now, and maybe that's the point." The recruit didn't answer. He just sat beside her, the two of them staring at the stars in silence. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt something close to peace. Not pride, not joy, but peace, because someone had asked the right question. Someone had seen her. But peace never stayed long. The next morning, orders arrived. She was to be transferred temporarily, attached to a special unit overseas. Publicity, yes, but also something more: a test. The commanders wanted to prove that their symbol wasn't just for stages and photographs, that she could still walk where danger lived. Elena held the papers in her hand, her chest tightening. The desert called again. And with it the ghosts. What does it mean to return to the place that broke you? The question echoed in Elena's mind as the C-130 roared across the night sky. The aircraft vibrated with the weight of gear, rifles, and men who spoke in clipped tones to mask their nerves. She sat among them, helmet resting on her knee, eyes fixed on the riveted steel wall. She didn't belong here. Not anymore, she knew it. They knew it. And yet here she was, pulled back into the desert she thought she'd left behind. They didn't call it punishment. They called it demonstration. A chance to show that the symbol was real. That private first-class tours, the Silver Star recipient, was still the soldier they made her out to be. But Elena knew the truth. She wasn't being tested for herself. She was being tested for them, for the image, the legend, the story too powerful to let fade. The sergeant sitting across from her leaned forward, shouting over the engine, "You good, Tors?" She nodded, though her stomach churned. "Good," he said with a grin. "Command says you're the one to watch." The others smirked, some with respect, others with doubt. One soldier muttered under his breath, just loud enough, "Legends look different up close." Elena kept her eyes on the wall. She'd heard it before. The mission was straightforward, or so they said. A reconnaissance patrol outside the wire, sweeping a valley where insurgent activity had been reported. Simple presence, nothing flashy. But the desert never listened to simplicity. By dawn, their convoy rumbled across cracked earth, sand dusting their uniforms, the horizon shimmering with heat. Elena sat in the rear vehicle, rifle across her lap, eyes scanning the ridgeline. Every shadow felt alive. Every gust of wind carried memory. She forced herself to breathe steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth, just like she told the recruits. But her chest was tight, her hands damp. The sergeant beside her nudged her with an elbow. "Relax, Tors, just another ride." She nodded faintly, but she knew better. In the desert, nothing was just another. They reached the valley by midday. The heat was merciless, pressing down like a hand. The patrol spread out, boots crunching against rock, eyes sharp. Elena moved quietly, steady, her weapon held tight. The silence unnerved her. Too much silence, always too much. A memory clawed at her. Another valley, another night, the sudden explosion that had ripped through stillness. Her breath faltered. Then the crack came. A single shot, sharp, distant. The unit dropped instantly, scanning, shouting coordinates. Elena's chest seized. Her eyes darted across the ridgeline, searching. Shadows shifted, dust rose. "Contact northeast ridge," a voice roared. The firefight erupted. Gunfire echoed off stone, rounds snapping through the air. The soldiers returned fire, rifles chattering, the valley filling with smoke and sound. Elena's hands shook as she raised her rifle. She fired, steady bursts, the recoil jolting her shoulder. The air stung with grit, sweat burning her eyes. But as she pressed into the dirt, something inside her cracked open. The ghost surged. She saw the old night again. The convoy burning, men screaming, her body dragging them through the sand. She heard the cries, the radio static, the pounding in her ears. Her breath came ragged, she froze. Bullets tore the earth inches from her arm. A soldier shouted her name. "Tors, move." Her mind screamed at her body to act, to crawl, to fire, to lead. But for a heartbeat too long, she was paralyzed. And in that pause, one of the younger soldiers broke cover. A rookie, barely 20. He scrambled, panicked, exposed. Gunfire sliced toward him. Something snapped in Elena's chest. She surged forward. Her legs moved before thought. She grabbed his vest, yanking him down behind the rock just as rounds exploded against the dirt where he'd been. He stared at her, wide-eyed, breathless. You saved me," he stammered. Elena's voice came sharp, raw. "Stay down, breathe. Don't move unless you're ready." Her hand steadied. Her breath evened. The paralysis broke. She pressed her cheek to the rifle stock and fired again, measured, precise. Her vision cleared. Not of ghosts, those never left, but of hesitation. She wasn't a legend. She wasn't a myth. She was a soldier in the dirt, scared but moving anyway. And that was enough. The firefight dragged on. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. But slowly the insurgents' fire thinned. Air support screamed overhead, thunder rolling through the valley. The ridgeline quieted. The silence that followed was different, heavy, not empty. The unit regrouped, breathless, sweat-soaked, eyes darting in the fatting smoke. The rookie Elena had pulled down, stared at her with something like awe. Others looked at her too, some with gratitude, some with something sharper, recognition. The sergeant clapped her shoulder. "Still got it, Tors." She didn't answer. She just nodded, her chest heaving, the ghost still whispering inside. That night back at the forward outpost, the soldiers gathered in a circle, their nerves unraveling into jokes, curses, shaky laughter. Elena sat apart, cleaning her rifle with steady hands. The rookie approached, hesitant. He sat beside her, silent at first, then softly. "Back there, I thought I was dead." Elena glanced at him. His face was pale, eyes still wide. She saw herself in him, 19, afraid, untested. "You weren't," she said simply. He swallowed. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Because you stayed down once I pulled you. You listened. That saved you." He frowned. "But you." Elena cut him off gently. "I was scared too. Don't ever think fear means you're failing. It means you're alive. What matters is you don't let it stop you." The recruit nodded slowly, his shoulders easing. And as he sat beside her in silence, Elena realized something. She couldn't stop the world from painting her as a symbol. She couldn't erase the headlines, the photographs, the speeches. But here, in the dirt, face to face, she could tell the truth. And maybe that was enough. When they rotated back to the main base, command was quick to debrief. Reports praised the patrol, casualties none, lives saved several, and at the center of it again her name. The officers nodded with approval. Once again, Torres proves why she's a symbol. Elena stood at attention, her face unreadable. Inside, her chest ached, not from pride, not from shame, from something in between, a strange acceptance that she would never escape the weight of the story. But perhaps she didn't need to, because she wasn't carrying it for herself anymore. She was carrying it for the young soldiers who looked at her with wide eyes, for the mothers who wrote letters, for the ghosts she whispered to at night. Her story was heavier than she ever wanted, but maybe some burdens weren't meant to be dropped. Maybe they were meant to be carried, quietly, steadily, until the world learned to see what courage truly looked like. That night in her bunk overseas, Elena lay awake staring at the canvas ceiling. The sounds of the outpost drifted in, boots, murmurs, distant generators humming. She held the medal in her palm, cold, heavy. She whispered the names again, the ritual she never abandoned. And this time she added one more. Not a name of the dead, a name of the living, the rookie she'd pulled down, the one who might have been gone if she hadn't moved. She realized then the medal wasn't about the past. Not only, it was also about the present, about every life she touched, saved, mentored, guided. And maybe even the future. She closed her eyes, the weight of ghosts still pressing, but her breath came steadier. Because sometimes, survival isn't the absence of fear. It's moving anyway, again and again, no matter how heavy the story becomes. What does it mean to come home after carrying the weight of two wars, the one on the battlefield and the one inside your own chest? Elena asked herself that as the plane touched down on the runway, its wheels screeching against familiar ground. The soldiers around her cheered, some laughing, some shouting with the wild relief of survival. Elena sat quietly, her helmet in her lap, staring through the oval window at the gray morning sky. Home, at least, that's what they called it. But what is home to a soldier who has lived too long in deserts, in shadows, in silence? She stepped off the aircraft into the cool air, the hum of engines fatting behind her. The base stretched out, the same buildings, the same barracks, but everything felt altered. Or maybe it wasn't the base that had changed. Maybe it was her. The welcome was swift, almost overwhelming. Applause, handshakes, speeches. Reporters clustered outside the gates, cameras raised, shouting her name. Elena kept her face calm, her stride steady, but her heart beat hard against her ribs. Every question cut sharp. How does it feel to be a hero again? What message do you have for young women watching? Do you believe you represent the future of the military? She gave them nothing but silence or carefully measured words. I serve, that's all. The cameras didn't care. They spun her words into stories anyway. Stories of strength, stories of courage, stories that were easier to digest than the truth she carried in her chest. At night back in her room, Elena pulled the blinds shut and sat in the quiet. She took the medal in her hands, running her thumb over its edges. She whispered the names again, the ones she'd carried across deserts, through gunfire, into silence. The ghosts were still there, but so too were the living faces she now remembered, the rookie she'd pulled down, the recruits she'd mentored, the mothers who wrote to say their daughters dreamed bigger because of her. Maybe that was what home was. Not the place, not the barracks, not the uniform. Home was the act of carrying others, even when the weight bent your back. Weeks passed. Elena's schedule filled with ceremonies, interviews, visits to academies. She sat before crowds of recruits, rows of civilians, faces she didn't know, but who looked at her as though she embodied something they had lost. She never spoke of victory, never of heroics. Her words were quieter, more deliberate. "I was afraid," she would say. "I didn't think I would make it out, but I couldn't leave them. That's all courage is, choosing not to leave someone behind." The rooms always fell silent when she spoke. Some nodded, some cried. And in that silence she felt seen, not for the myth but for the truth. Still each night she returned to solitude. She removed the medal, laid it beside her bunk, whispered the names. The ghosts remained, but they no longer drowned her. They sat beside her in the silence, part of her story, part of her truth. Her commanding officer visited her one evening, months after her return. His face was older now, lines deeper, eyes heavy with something she recognized: humility. "Tors," he said quietly, standing in the doorway, "I owe you something more than an apology." She looked up from her bunk, waiting. "I owe you the truth," he said. "I underestimated you, not because you lacked skill, but because I couldn't see past my own assumptions. You taught me something I should have known, that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quiet until the moment comes." Elena nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir." He hesitated. "Do you regret it, any of it?" Her throat tightened. She thought of the nights, the screams, the ghosts. She thought of the recruits, the rookie she'd pulled down, the letters stacked in a shoebox under her bed. Finally she answered, "I regret the losses, I regret the silence, but not the choice, never the choice." The officer nodded, his jaw tight. Then he saluted her, a gesture of respect not from rank but from understanding. She returned it quietly. Time moved on. Seasons shifted. Elena found herself less on stages, more in classrooms, training yards, quiet rooms where recruits asked questions too raw for textbooks. She told them the truth. That fear was real. That loss would come. That medals don't erase memories. She reminded them that no one fights alone, and that the greatest strength is not found in who shouts loudest, but in who moves quietly, steadily, when everything else has fallen apart. They listened. They carried her words forward. And slowly, Elena saw her legacy take root, not in ceremonies, not in photographs, but in the way young soldiers held themselves when fear came knocking. One evening, long after the sun had dipped, Elena walked alone to the edge of the parade ground. The base was quiet, the night air cool. She stood beneath the stars, the medal pinned against her chest, her posture steady. She thought of the girl she had once been, 19, unnoticed, carrying trays, trying to be invisible. She thought of the night in the desert that had carved her life into before and after. She thought of the mess hall, the silence that had followed the general's question, the eyes that had finally seen her. And she realized something. Her life had not been defined by medals or ceremonies. It had been defined by moments of choice. Each time she chose not to leave someone behind. Each time she chose to move, even when fear clawed at her chest. Each time she chose dignity over silence. And maybe that was all any soldier could hope for. Not to be a legend, not to be a symbol, but to be someone who chose, again and again, to act with courage when it mattered most. She lifted her face to the sky, eyes wet but steady. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. Sometimes it doesn't argue, doesn't demand, doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply acts. And when it does, the world cannot help but notice.